President Xi, do you know exactly what the supreme leader of Iran and a severely burnt piece of fried chicken share in common? That inquiry lingered in the atmosphere, thick and piercing, cutting directly across the stifling quiet inside the Hall of Supreme Harmony. This wasn't the sort of opening remark you'd ever discover inside a State Department briefing folder. It wasn't the sanitized, focus group-approved garbage that the Washington elite had been spoon-feeding the American populace for decades. This was unfiltered. This was a deliberate bomb dropped high above the sprawling grounds of the Forbidden City. The afternoon sun was bleeding away. It threw a fake golden hue over the ancient, sweeping rooftops, attempting to emit a warmth that simply was absent in this space. Down below, past the thick wooden doors, the state-run broadcast cameras were fixed in position. They were recording what they assumed would be a routine, predictable meeting. They anticipated a courteous swap of diplomatic empty words, a photo op meant to calm the anxious financial markets. They anticipated the American commander-in-chief to follow the unwritten, cowardly guidelines of globalist manners. Yet up here on this secluded balcony, devoid of the handlers and the yes-men, the mood was as freezing and merciless as a maximum security interrogation chamber. The solitary noise trying to bridge the emptiness was the subtle, steady trickling of premium tea being poured into a ceramic cup. Drip, drip. Every single splash sounded deafening enough to crack glass. An astute watcher, someone not blinded by the legacy media's constant propaganda, would instantly spot the stark contrast between the two figures sitting opposite each other at the narrow wooden desk. On one side lounged the American president, clad in his trademark navy blue suit. It was an outfit that radiated undeniable economic muscle, unapologetic capitalism, and the sort of raw, pragmatic force that constructed the modern globe. He leaned slightly forward, his stance relaxed yet predatory. He was the total personification of a republic that was finally finished apologizing for its own brilliance. Opposite him sat the chairman. He was buttoned rigidly into a classic dark Mao suit. It was attire meticulously engineered to broadcast unity, historical continuity, and the quiet, creeping supremacy of a regime that had spent years purchasing the planet. They had been acquiring the globe, while America's political establishment averted their gaze, too preoccupied with stuffing their own bank accounts to recognize the peril. Right now, however, the chairman remained entirely still. His expression was a masterclass in stoicism, mirroring a stone monolith that had endured centuries of hurricanes. But beneath those narrow, unblinking eyes, a frantic calculation was unfolding. Quiet was the only tool the host had remaining. It was a maneuver that had functioned perfectly against the feeble, accommodating politicians of yesteryear. The globalist elites, the lifelong bureaucrats from the swamp, would typically race to bridge a silence like this one. They would be terrified of causing an insult, eager to present a compromise merely to keep the dialogue flowing and safeguard their precious international norms. But Donald Trump did not flinch. He allowed the silence to elongate. He let it coil around the chairman's throat like a tightening cord. He was not in a hurry. The president reclined a bit, the edges of his mouth curling upward into a knowing, hazardous smirk. They are both done. The words crashed like a hammer upon an anvil. And nobody can swallow something that burnt. He didn't pause for a translator to cushion the impact. He didn't wait for an intimidated diplomat to reword it into something more digestible for the international press corps. He locked eyes directly with the man who had funded the exact adversaries America was currently taking apart. And that, Mr. Chairman, is precisely what occurs when you attempt to extort the United States of America with a pile of garbage missiles. There it was. The absolute reality that the left-wing corporate media, back in New York and D.C., had been frantically attempting to conceal for months. The talking heads on the legacy networks had been weaving a non-stop narrative of panic. They convinced the American populace that resisting Tehran would spark World War III. They cautioned that placing America first would isolate the nation, that demonstrating resolve was somehow a moral flaw. They desired the public to buy into the idea that the Iranian regime was an unstoppable, horrifying power. They wanted you to think that the sole remedy was to pacify them with pallets of untraceable currency and catastrophic, one-sided nuclear agreements. Yet, sitting on that balcony thousands of miles from the deceitful Beltway, the president was tearing down the facade. He was exposing the empty center of the adversary, and he was executing it right to the face of their primary global backer. The chairman finally shifted. His hands leisurely extended for his teacup, a deliberate, heavily regulated movement meant to camouflage the jolt of the direct attack. You possess a very, unconventional method of initiating a dialogue, Mr. President. His tone was slick, bearing the translated gravity of an ancient dynasty, but there was a glaring hint of strain beneath the exterior, a tiny fracture in the porcelain mask. Unconventional? The president released a deep, raspy laugh that contained zero warmth. I call it slicing through the nonsense. We can sit here and chat about bilateral teamwork and mutual regard until the sun rises tomorrow. We can grin for the lenses and act like everything is peachy. But you and I both comprehend why we are actually seated at this desk. You assumed your buddies in the Middle East had us trapped. You assumed they could amass a giant arsenal of ballistic and cruise missiles, stash them in caverns, and utilize them as a buffer. The scheme was elementary, wasn't it? They were going to mass manufacture cheap drones, escalate their military output, and then pivot to the rest of the globe. They were going to pivot to us, pivot to Israel, and declare that they were rebooting their nuclear arms initiative. They assumed they could menace to obliterate the whole region. They assumed they could threaten to drop payloads on London, Paris, and Berlin if we dared to halt them. The president angled forward once more, drumming a single commanding finger on the wooden surface. But they miscalculated. And frankly, Chairman, so did you. If you believed I was going to permit that to unfold on my watch, think about what the deep state desired in this precise scenario. They craved endless, paralyzing diplomatic talks. They wanted to empower globalist bodies like the UN to draft strongly worded memos while our foes armed themselves to the teeth. They despised this president, not because he was unpolished, but because he outright refused to participate in their rigged casino. He refused to act as if the emperor was fully clothed. He circumvented their entire rotten structure, and at this very moment, he was demonstrating exactly why he needed to. The supreme leader is gone, the president proceeded, his tone lowering an octave, projecting the complete confidence of a player holding every card and knowing exactly how to deploy them. And, the framework that sustained his little blackmail operation, it is presently resting in smoking rubble. The chairman took a measured sip of his brew, his gaze never departing from the president. He was hunting for a weakness in the armor. He was searching for a tell of a bluff, a trace of the standard Western self-doubt he was so used to manipulating during his interactions with prior administrations. He uncovered absolutely nothing. The world is a complicated arena, President Trump. Might is not perpetually gauged by what you demolish. Sometimes it is gauged by what you construct and who you construct it alongside. It was a textbook, calculated evasion. It was a pivot to the extended game, an endeavor to guide the dialogue back toward the safe haven of diplomatic vagueness. But the president was a virtuoso at commanding the tempo of the room. He wasn't about to let the chairman withdraw into philosophical puzzles. He was going to pin him to the wall with reality. Let me educate you about what is being constructed right now in Iran, absolutely zero. Because you cannot construct a thing when your whole society is in a complete, unrecoverable nosedive. The president allowed the gravity of the scenario to linger in the air. He was compelling the chairman to face the botched investment his nation had executed, compelling him to gaze at the debris of his geopolitical pawn. This was the exact instance the deep state back home feared above all else. This was the raw reality that utterly destroyed their meticulously woven narrative of American frailty and inevitable downward spiral. The left-wing politicians and their media lapdogs would prefer you believe that the circumstance was a gridlock. They would appear on Sunday morning broadcasts and boldly announce that the America First doctrine had somehow backfired. But here was the commander-in-chief, seated in the core of Beijing, presenting the undeniable, savage statistics of triumph. It was a triumph attained not by perpetual bloody invasions, but by overwhelming, focused economic and military pressure, and the individuals sitting opposite him recognized it. The chairman realized that the proxies he banked on to divert the United States were being systematically torn apart. He recognized that the epoch of American surrender, the epoch of apologizing for surviving, was conclusively finished. The quiet seeped back onto the balcony, but it was no longer the chairman's instrument, it belonged to the president. He remained there, washed in the fading dusk, letting the truth of the fried chicken comparison seep deep into the marrow of the globalist framework. He had planted the hook. He had obliterated the assumption that America's foes were bulletproof. And as the sun finally sank beneath the skyline, plunging the courtyards into darkness, the actual conflict was merely commencing. The president had presented the carcass of the Iranian menace on the table. Now he was pausing for the chairman to execute his subsequent move. He was awaiting the inevitable retaliation, the frantic gamble that the globalists consistently attempted to execute when forced into a corner. He knew the chairman kept a card concealed up his sleeve, a card supplied to him by a feeble, compromising partner in Europe. But what the chairman remained unaware of, what the deep state had no clue about, was that the president had already manipulated the deck. The contest was on, and the wagers were nothing short of the preservation of the free world. The expiring sun threw a blood-orange shine across the sleek rosewood desk, illuminating the dust particles that hung suspended in the suffocating atmosphere of the Forbidden City. This was the exact style of table where, for decades, globalist officials had secretly sold out American laborers over polite servings of tea. They would travel here, beam for the cameras, rehearse their carefully drafted apologies for American exceptionalism, and sign away our global leverage. But not today. Today, that vintage rosewood table was an executioner's chopping block, and the man wearing the navy blue suit gripped the axe. Welcome back to the broadcast, patriots. If you are just turning us on, we are transporting you behind the fiercely secured doors of the 14th of May 2026, directly into the most pivotal diplomatic clash of our generation. The corporate media will never broadcast the truth regarding what occurred in that chamber, because the truth shatters their entire perspective on the world. They have squandered years attempting to persuade you that the Iranian regime is a complex, terrifying military powerhouse that must be placated at all expenses. They needed you frightened of the mullahs so they could rationalize shipping them pallets of untraceable currency in the dead of night. But sitting directly across from the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, President Trump was preparing to tear the mask off that falsehood. He was preparing to deliver a crushing indictment of a proxy empire that had been absolutely decimated by the America First agenda. The president angled his body forward, the leather of his seat groaning slightly, a noise that appeared to bounce like a gunshot in the hushed space. You know, Chairman, the intellectuals in Washington adore utilizing massive words to characterize your pals in Tehran. They babble about asymmetric conflict and regional dominance. But allow me to offer you a phrase from Louisiana, a phrase authentic Americans grasp. Right now, both the public and the private sectors in Iran are being stitched together with spit and duct tape. The host stops here to let that penetrate, folks. Spit and duct tape. It is genius, it is raw, and it is savagely precise. The State Department elites would pass out if they caught wind of phrasing like that, but that is precisely why the American voting base put this man in office. He slices through the bureaucratic haze and hands the unfiltered reality right to the individuals who assume they run the globe. The chairman's eyes flickered the most microscopic fracture in his ice-cold exterior as he analyzed the utter disrespect of the analogy. He was accustomed to dealing with fragile European heads of state who shook at the mere thought of displeasing him. He was not accustomed to an American president who stared at his multi-billion-dollar Middle Eastern project and labeled it a scrapyard. Spit and duct tape is not a recognized military doctrine, Mr. President, the chairman eventually responded, his tone a deep, measured hum. No, it's a reality doctrine. The president fired back immediately, yielding not a single millimeter of breathing space. Let's review the statistics. 'Cause I know you adore statistics, Chairman. 7 out of 10 Iranians are jobless. 7 out of 10. That is not a functioning economy, that is a cemetery. You supported a regime that swore to erase us from the map. And now they cannot even place bread on the table for their own populace. We bombed their infrastructure back into the Stone Age. We struck the targets that actually carried weight. The ones the gutless politicians in my nation were always too paralyzed to touch. And what is the consequence? They are drowning in 70% inflation. Ponder that for a moment, my friends. 70% inflation. The mainstream media pundits in New York City whine when their pricey lattes increase by 50 cents. Yet they sought to empower a regime that has bankrupted an entire nation. The Iranian currency is garbage, utterly annihilated by the relentless, suffocating pressure of maximum sanctions. And when the citizens recognize they are starving while the rulers loot their wealth, the president resumed, his voice sinking into a threatening whisper. The regime freaks out. Their internet is disconnected. They are forced to submerge their whole nation into digital blackness merely to halt the truth from escaping. A government that is forced to flip off the lights to endure is not a government you should be wagering on, Chairman. The president was systematically taking apart the illusion of the Sino-Iranian pact piece by piece. He was laying bare the reality that Beijing had tethered itself to a sinking vessel. But he wasn't finished just yet. He was preparing to shift from economic ruin to military embarrassment. This is the segment that the Pentagon desk jockeys attempted to conceal from you, the segment the Democrats desperately pray you ignore. You comprehend better than anyone what we have executed on the military front, the president stated, flattening his hands on the desk, because I am confident your intelligence bureaus observed it occur in real time. Their launchers? Gone. Those expensive ballistic missiles they adore parading around Tehran? For the most part, entirely erased. Their drone manufacturing plants? Vaporized. The factories that were meant to construct the swarm that would overwhelm our defenses are nothing except smoking craters out in the sand. The chairman shifted his posture ever so marginally, a microscopic telltale sign that the president was striking a nerve. This wasn't merely an assault on Iran, it was an assault on the Chinese tech and capital that had constructed that military machine in the first instance. And let's discuss their conventional units, the president remarked, a dark grin dancing on his lips. Their navy? Gone. Sent to the floor of the ocean. Their air force? Gone. It is a complete and absolute military degradation. The host intervenes again, because this is the sheer core of the issue. For years, the left assured us that if we confronted these dictators, we would be pulled into a massive, bloody ground conflict. They assured us it was unfeasible to degrade an adversary's arsenal without forfeiting thousands of American lives. But the president proved them incorrect. He deployed precision. He deployed overwhelming tech supremacy. And he deployed the pure, terrifying promise of American willpower. He didn't require putting infantry on the soil to eradicate their navy. He simply needed to issue the command that the prior administrations were too spineless to issue. "I could board an aircraft right this second," the president informed the chairman, his eyes ablaze with pure certainty. "I personally could soar anywhere I desire across the entirety of Iran right now and remain entirely safe." Do you realize why? Because they possess zero air defenses left. We eliminated them all. They are entirely exposed from the heavens. Picture the absolute shockwaves pulsating through the chairman's brain at this juncture. The American president is sitting in Beijing, mocking him with the reality that his grandest proxy military is entirely unprotected. It is an unparalleled exhibition of dominance. "The intelligence is open," the president declared, leaning back and folding his arms. "It will take, in my estimation, at least 20 years, and burn $1 trillion before they are even marginally back to functional. $1 trillion. And I do not possess the faintest clue where they intend to acquire that capital." He allowed the figure to hover in the air, a colossal, unpayable deficit, resting entirely upon the chairman's shoulders. If they assume China is going to hand it to them, or if they assume Russia possesses the funds to rescue them, they are going to absorb a very brutal lesson. They are insolvent. Half of their oil deposits are low pressure. Once they shut them off, they are never spinning them back up. The embargo is airtight. Zero is entering, and zero is exiting. We have accomplished our goal. We guaranteed they will never construct a nuclear weapon, because they no longer possess a nation to construct one inside. This is the reality of the America First principle, folks. It is not regarding sparking conflicts, it is regarding concluding them before they initiate, by ensuring the price of defying us is utterly inconceivable. The left desires you to feel pity for the regime. The globalists desire you to suspect that this magnitude of devastation is somehow unjust or unequal. But out in the actual world, out where the predators hunt, the singular element that ensures tranquility is the absolute, irrefutable eradication of your adversary's capability to inflict damage. The chairman stared at the president, his facade of apathy ultimately revealing indications of fracturing under the ceaseless onslaught of facts. He recognized that every syllable the American was uttering was entirely accurate. The Iranian maneuver had collapsed. The spit and duct tape empire had crumbled under the pressure of an American leader who actually cherished his nation enough to protect it. But the chairman was a survivor, an individual who had ascended to the peak of a cutthroat communist apparatus. He was not about to capitulate without deploying his ultimate card. He inhaled a slow, intentional breath, fixing his cuffs as he braced to pivot away from the smoking wreckage of the Middle East. He was going to attempt to alter the battleground. He was going to gaze toward the Indian Ocean, toward a tiny atoll named Diego Garcia, and toward a feeble British Prime Minister named Keir Starmer. The chairman presumed he held a clandestine weapon, a backroom arrangement that the globalists had handed him on a silver tray. But as we are about to discover, the deep state's little backup policy was already dead on arrival. The president had already anticipated the maneuver, and he had already swapped the locks. Do not switch the station, patriots. You do not want to miss what unfolds next when we dive back into the Forbidden City. The atmosphere in the Forbidden City was becoming denser by the second, not from the moisture of the approaching Beijing summer, but from the overwhelming, undeniable gravity of American supremacy. Welcome back to the broadcast, my fellow patriots. If you are just tuning in, you are grabbing a front-row ticket to the most spectacular diplomatic dismantling of the 21st century. We are inside the chamber. The 14th of May 2026. We are observing the commander-in-chief sit opposite the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, and he is not flinching. He has just detailed the complete obliteration of the Iranian regime. He has just illustrated a portrait of a country glued together by nothing besides spit and duct tape, its military vaporized, its financial system choking beneath the strain of 70% inflation. He has demonstrated that the America First doctrine is not merely a catchphrase, it is a deadly, accurate tool of global reality. But now the president is preparing to pivot. He is preparing to shift from the adversaries overseas to the adversaries domestically. Because you and I both comprehend, and the president definitely comprehends, that the toughest struggles are not always waged in the dunes of the Middle East or the currents of the South China Sea. The most deceitful struggles are waged directly in the center of Washington, D.C. They are waged against a lifelong political elite, a profoundly embedded swamp, and a corporate media machine that acts as the PR branch of the globalist establishment. The president leaned back in his elaborately sculpted wooden seat, allowing the harsh truths regarding Iran to settle across the desk. He monitored the chairman. He monitored the delicate, almost undetectable clenching of the chairman's jaw. The chairman is an individual who banks on perception, on the mirage of power, and the president had just smashed that mirage entirely. A faint, almost taunting grin danced on the president's mouth. He grasped exactly what the chairman was pondering. He grasped that the chairman, just like every other autocrat across the planet, had been glued to CNN, MSNBC, and the columns of the New York Times. They monitor our media, folks. They monitor our legacy press to assess our national willpower, and what they observe is a continuous, pitiful flow of self-hatred and fabricated division. You know, Chairman, the president commenced, his pitch dipping to a casual, nearly conspiratorial level. I view the news just like you do, and I recognize what my Democratic colleagues back home are attempting to declare. They are sprinting around Capitol Hill. They're sitting in their pristine broadcasting studios, and they are attempting to claim we have been defeated. The host must pause right here, because this is the exact textbook definition of psychological warfare. The president is seizing the very talking points that the Chinese Communist Party hopes to weaponize, and he is dragging them out into the sunlight. He is validating the internal friction of the United States, but he is doing it to illustrate that he is totally impervious to it. He is staring at the chairman and declaring, I realize you perceive the fissures in my armor, but those fissures are painted on by fabricators. They are trying to inform the globe that our strategy has flopped. The president proceeded, his eyes tracking onto the chairman with the focus of a laser. They desire everyone to believe that possessing all the cards is somehow a strategic error. But you realize they are deceiving, correct? The silence that ensued was dense enough to slice with a blade. The chairman did not respond. He could not respond. To concur would be to concede that the American press was a farce, and to object would be to deny the smoking rubble of his Iranian asset. He was trapped within the president's verbal enclosure. They know exactly what we have achieved. The president affirmed, his tone solidifying. The relaxed vibe swapped for a chilling, justified fury. They possess the identical classified briefings that I do. They review the satellite photos. They know the strait is locked down. They know the oil deposits are powering down. And they know the mullahs are pleading for mercy in the shadows. But they will never confess it on camera. This is the disease of the deep state, patriots. This is the tumor gnawing away at the bedrock of our magnificent republic. We possess a political wing in this nation that is so devoured by its own craving for dominance, so blinded by its illogical animosity for one individual, that they are prepared to derail American foreign affairs. They detest me more than they cherish America, the president announced. The phrase bounced off the antique, tapestry-draped walls of the Hall of Supreme Harmony. They detest me more than they cherish America. Let that statement sink deep into your soul. It is the heartbreaking, undeniable reality of the modern Democratic faction and their lapdogs in the legacy press. They would prefer to witness the United States shamed on the global platform than witness Donald J. Trump lock down a historic win. They would prefer to see a terror-funding state obtain a nuclear device than confess that the America First agenda preserved global safety. That is precisely why they conceal the truth that Iran is on its knees, the president remarked, driving the ultimate nail into the casket of the media spin. They are forced to conceal it, because if the American populace genuinely comprehended what we have executed, if they witnessed the concrete outcomes of possessing a commander-in-chief who doesn't kneel and doesn't apologize, the swamp would be emptied. Overnight, the politicians would be unemployed, and the commentators would have nothing left to babble about. The chairman lethargically reached for his mug of tea, a calculated motion to purchase himself a split second to digest this barrage. He was observing something he fundamentally could not grasp. In his nation, the press exists purely to broadcast the absolute, undeniable might of the government. The concept of a domestic media corps actively striving to sabotage their own national defense for partisan profit was an exclusively Western infection, but the chairman also spotted something else. He spotted that the figure sitting opposite him was wholly unbridled by that rotten framework. The president was not terrified of the negative headlines. He was not about to tone down his conduct to secure the endorsement of the Washington Post editorial panel. He was functioning on a totally alternate wavelength, dealing exclusively in the currency of pure, unvarnished leverage. Your domestic politics are intricate, Mr. President, the chairman eventually mumbled, supplying a vague, non-committal diplomatic empty phrase. There is nothing intricate about it, Chairman. The president fired back immediately. It is incredibly straightforward. They desire to capitulate, and I refuse to permit them. They desire to hand over the keys to the castle because it makes them feel refined at their little cocktail gatherings. But I do not give a damn about their cocktail gatherings. I care regarding reality. And the reality is that the folks who wagered against the United States are currently insolvent, disarmed, and obsolete. The host is leaning into the microphone right now, because this is the instance of absolute lucidity. This is the broadcast that the globalists are petrified you will absorb. They desire you to believe that their perpetual concessions and their awful treaties are the exclusive method to govern the globe. They desire you to believe that tough leadership is hazardous, but what is genuinely hazardous is frailty. What is genuinely hazardous is a political tier that prizes the clapping of foreign officials above the protection of their own residents. The president was seated in the Forbidden City, laying bare the ultimate treason. He was proving to the chairman that the fracturing in America was not an indicator of a collapsing empire, but a symptom of a frantic, expiring political class that was forfeiting its grip on the narrative. You see, Chairman, the president noted, clasping his palms together and setting them on the table, the individuals who manage the television stations back home, the individuals who draft the think tank analyses, they reside in a bubble. They assume their words can alter the facts on the terrain. They assume that if they shout "we are failing" loudly enough, it will magically become reality. But words do not blast down missiles. Words do not reboot low-pressure oil reserves. And words absolutely do not intimidate me. My Democratic friends can holler into the abyss all they desire. They can convene their hearings, they can leak their fabricated tales to their preferred journalists, and they can attempt to persuade the world that the heavens are collapsing. But when the smoke clears, they still must wake up in a realm that I have locked down. They still must reside beneath the shield of security that my administration has constructed, regardless of whether they possess the integrity to confess it or not. The chairman maintained his silence. He was an architect of the extended game, a man who calculated in spans of decades and centuries, not voting cycles. He had perpetually banked on the brief attention span of the American populace and the cowardly disposition of American lawmakers to advance his objectives. He had perpetually figured that if he merely waited sufficiently long, the domestic fractures of the United States would cripple its foreign maneuvers. But Donald Trump was authoring new rules for the game right before his eyes. Trump was grabbing that domestic division, highlighting it, ridiculing it, and utterly neutralizing it as a tactical element. He was warning Beijing, "Do not confuse the clamor of my political rivals for the doctrine of the United States government. I am the doctrine. I am the individual holding the deck, and I am the individual forging the deals. So let them chatter." The president wrapped up, leaning back and shooting the chairman a gaze of pure, unshakable certainty. Let them utter whatever they please, because at the finish of the day, you and I both comprehend the truth. You comprehend that Iran is terminated. You comprehend that the era of American appeasement is deceased and buried. And you comprehend that the folks who despise me more than they love our nation are entirely helpless to block what is approaching next. The shadows in the chamber were stretching longer, the golden hour bleeding into a heavy, grave twilight. The president had systematically pulverized the chairman's Middle Eastern playbook, and he had utterly peeled away the facade of American weakness. He had highlighted the treacherous character of the globalist media, and he had cemented total psychological supremacy over the dialogue. But the chairman was not the head of a global superpower for zero reason. He was wounded. His schemes were naked. But he still retained one card to lay down. He still retained that little covert treaty in the Indian Ocean. He still retained the frailty of the British administration to lean upon. He assumed he held a trump card, a backdoor method to embarrass the United States and plant a foothold in a vital strategic alleyway. He was preparing to pivot to Diego Garcia. He was preparing to attempt and utilize the spinelessness of Prime Minister Keir Starmer to offset the dominance of the American president. But the chairman possessed absolutely zero clue what was anticipating him. He had no clue that he was strolling directly into a snare that the supreme dealmaker had deployed weeks earlier. The deep state assumed they had outwitted us. The globalists assumed they had nailed down a triumph. But they overlooked one vital element. They overlooked who they were crossing swords with. Do not touch that dial, patriots. When we return, we are going to examine the chairman's frantic retaliation, and we are going to reveal to you exactly how the president transformed their little backup policy into the most spectacular geopolitical punchline of the century. We are traveling to Diego Garcia, and we are carrying the actual replacement keys alongside us. The shadows extending across the gleaming rosewood desk were no longer merely the result of the descending sun. They were the physical manifestation of an altering combat zone. Welcome back to the broadcast, patriots. If you are just logging on, we are inside the Forbidden City, the 14th of May, 2026. We are observing the most extreme, high-stakes diplomatic card game in modern chronicles. The American president has just swung a sledgehammer into the Chinese chairman's Middle Eastern agenda. He has presented the undeniable, humiliating statistics regarding the utter collapse of the Iranian proxy syndicate. He has stripped away the spit and duct tape reality of their armed forces, and he has wholly brushed aside the panicked America. Last propaganda being hawked by the left-wing corporate media back stateside, the president has boxed in the dragon. But here is the reality regarding boxed-in dragons. Folks, they do not just flip over and surrender. They strike out. They search for a vulnerability, and if they cannot locate one in the plating of the American president, they search for one in the mushy, decaying underbelly of our alleged partners. They search for the globalists. The chairman rested perfectly motionless, digesting the savage reality of the president's statements. His Middle Eastern venture was evaporated, his proxy legion was declawed, and his endeavor to leverage American domestic discord as a tool had flopped utterly. For a split second, the chamber was so hushed you could detect the ancient beams of the Hall of Supreme Harmony shifting. And then it occurred. A subtle, chilling grin commenced to manifest on the chairman's visage. It was not a grin of entertainment, it was the icy, calculated smirk of a bureaucrat who realizes he possesses a secret ace tucked up his sleeve. It was the grin of an individual who assumes he has just uncovered the supreme loophole in the American security perimeter. The host needs to step in here and break down exactly how the psyches of these global rivals function. They recognize they cannot defeat us in a straightforward face-to-face clash of muscle, financial supremacy, or military ballistics. So, what do they execute? They manipulate the frailty of the international network. They manipulate the cowardice of politicians who prize appearing sophisticated at global summits more than they prize homeland security. And at this moment, the chairman was preparing to manipulate the sheer, astounding ineptitude of the British Parliament. He was preparing to play the Diego Garcia maneuver. Now, for those of you tuning in who might not possess a map of the Indian Ocean tacked to your wall, let me inform you what Diego Garcia represents. It is a minuscule, horseshoe-shaped territory in the center of nothingness, but do not allow its dimensions to deceive you. It is one of the most vital, highly classified, undeniably crucial strategic combat hubs on the surface of the globe. It is the point of the American lance. It is where our long-distance bombers launch from. It is where our subs anchor. And it is the linchpin that locks down the entire zone against the imperialist daydreams of the Chinese Communist Party. Minus Diego Garcia, our capacity to maneuver in that hemisphere is massively crippled, and the British, in their boundless progressive brilliance, technically possess the Chagos Islands, where this facility is situated. For decades, we have functioned there under an ironclad pact. But then the globalists seized control in London. Then entered Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Prime Minister Starmer, a figure so thirsty for the validation of the international aristocrats that he opted to simply surrender the islands. He opted to transfer them over to a nation called Mauritius, a nation that, historically speaking, maintains virtually zero actual linkage to the Chagos Islands whatsoever. But do you know who Mauritius does possess a linkage with? Do you know who their fresh best pals are? Beijing. They are BFFs, or whatever the youth term it these days. The chairman grasped this. He had engineered it. He had observed the British Prime Minister collapse like a flimsy lawn chair, and he had been anticipating this precise instance to smear it in the American president's face. The chairman deliberately extended his arm and tweaked the cuffs of his dark Mao uniform. He gazed across the rosewood table, the subtle grin now plastered permanently on his face. He assumed he was preparing to strike a lethal blow to the America First doctrine. The planet is an incredibly massive chessboard, Mr. President, the chairman stated, his pitch dropping to a slick, condescending drone. And while you have been wholly fixated on the cinders of the Middle East, it appears the currents have altered in the Indian Ocean. The president did not flinch. He merely monitored the chairman. His eyes slit, anticipating the punchline he already realized was approaching. I am confident you are conscious of the recent diplomatic victories of your tightest ally. The chairman proceeded, savoring every single consonant. Prime Minister Starmer is an incredibly progressive intellectual. He grasps that the epoch of Western imperialism is concluded, and he grasps the significance of restoring territory to its legitimate proprietors. The host can barely restrain the revulsion right now, folks. Pay attention to the vocabulary they deploy. They deploy the vocabulary of social justice. They deploy the guilt-inducing talking points of the extreme left to rationalize a colossal capitulation of military dominance. They camouflage a geopolitical catastrophe in the wardrobe of historical fairness. And the most terrible part is, the establishment lawmakers swallow it every single time. They are so petrified of being labeled insults by the international press that they will literally pass the keys to the fortress over to our biggest enemy. Mauritius is a magnificent nation, the chairman noted, tilting marginally forward. And they are incredibly fine companions of ours. We possess a profound bilateral bond. We construct their infrastructure. We bolster their economy. And in exchange, they provide us a degree of collaboration that is unparalleled. The chairman was not merely speaking, he was bragging. He was sketching the exact schematic of how the deep state betrays the free world. He was showcasing the reality that he did not have to fire a single bullet to jeopardize one of the most vital American military outposts on the earth. He simply had to pause for a weak, left-wing official in Europe to ink a sheet of paper. So you observe, Mr. President. The chairman finalized, locking eyes with the commander-in-chief. Mr. President, you might triumph in the Middle East, but in the Indian Ocean, Mr. Starmer has already handed us the spare key to Diego Garcia. There it landed. The retaliation, the ultimate trump card that the globalists had gifted to the Chinese Communist Party, packaged in a tidy little ribbon. The chairman leaned back, the subtle grin, now an expression of complete, arrogant victory. He assumed he had conquered the summit. He assumed he had demonstrated that American dominance could perpetually be circumvented by European frailty. He believed he had just locked down a permanent docking hub for his naval armada directly next door to our classified bombers. Envision the sheer audacity of this instance. Envision sitting opposite the leader of the free world and informing him that his own partners had just sold him out. The corporate media would have you think that this is simply how foreign policy functions. They would instruct you that we simply must embrace this fresh reality, that we must divide the ocean, that we cannot be tyrants regarding our military installations. They would have you think that Prime Minister Starmer executed a noble, ethical choice. But you and I realize the truth. As the President himself has declared, there have been some awfully terrible deals formulated by the Brits, especially when it concerns Diego Garcia. It was a horrendous deal. It was an arrangement that would impose severe restrictions on how our forces could confront hazards and how we could operate that island. It was a capitulation, and the chairman assumed the President of the United States was tethered by that capitulation. He assumed that because a sheet of paper was autographed in London, the American armed forces were merely going to pack up their luggage, surrender the spare key, and permit Beijing to establish operations in the Indian Ocean. He assumed he was negotiating with a conventional politician. He assumed he was negotiating with someone who revered the bureaucratic garbage of the international rules-based structure more than he revered the safety and defense of the American populace. The hush returned to the balcony. But it was a distinct breed of hush now. It was the hush of a snare snapping shut. The chairman assumed he was the individual springing the snare. He assumed he had the American president totally boxed in. But what the chairman neglected to comprehend, what the whole globalist apparatus perpetually neglects to comprehend, is that Donald J. Trump does not participate by their guidelines. He does not swallow garbage deals simply because somebody else inked them. He does not honor pacts that jeopardize American independence. And, he definitely does not permit a fragile prime minister in London to dictate the military stance of the United States of America. The chairman's grin remained a monument to the hubris of the international elite. He was waiting for the president to blink. He was waiting for the president to exhibit a flash of annoyance, a flash of defeat. He was waiting for the president to begin discussing managing the transition or seeking bilateral working groups to address the security concerns. But the president simply remained seated. He gazed at the chairman's arrogant, contented face. He gazed at the individual who assumed he had just outmaneuvered the grandest dealmaker on the planet, and the president did not blink. He did not frown. He did not elevate his volume. Rather, a distinct kind of expression began to materialize on the president's features. It was not a grin. It was the icy, stern glare of a property owner who was preparing to boot out a highly troublesome renter. The chairman had dropped his most massive card on the desk. He had deployed the Diego Garcia spare key, but the contest was not finished. Actually, the genuine masterclass in American leverage was merely preparing to commence, because what the chairman was preparing to discover, and what the entire planet was preparing to discover, is that possessing a spare key does not mean a single, solitary thing if the locks have already been replaced. Do not travel anywhere, patriots. Keep your receivers dialed right here. Because, when we return in Part 5, we are going to observe the exact second the president brings the hammer down on the chairman's grand fantasy. We are going to listen to the retort that the mainstream media declined to air. We are going to witness what authentic, unapologetic America First guidance resembles when it is staring down a hijacked geopolitical advantage. The left assumed they surrendered the Indian Ocean, but they forgot who genuinely possesses the title deed. Stay alongside us. The Forbidden City was descending into a profound, bruised violet as the sun ultimately yielded to the horizon. Up on that balcony, the atmosphere didn't simply feel chilly. It felt charged, similar to the seconds right before a lightning bolt strikes the earth. The chairman sat there possessing that arrogant, self-contented smirk, assuming he had just landed the knockout punch. He genuinely believed that a weak-kneed globalist official in London had passed him the keys to the kingdom. He assumed that by exploiting the guilt-plagued conscience of the British establishment, he had triumphantly bypassed the American armed forces. He assumed he had outwitted the man in the navy blue suit. But our narrator, that astute watcher who grasps precisely how the deep state functions, could perceive the reality. He could perceive that the chairman was cheering a triumph that did not exist. You know, Chairman, I've witnessed a multitude of garbage deals in my era, the president finally articulated, and his tone wasn't loaded with the rage or panic the chairman was anticipating. Instead, it was loaded with a dry, taunting entertainment that appeared to bounce off the antique stone barriers. I've witnessed individuals barter their souls for a headline, and I've witnessed politicians hand away the farm merely to acquire a pat on the shoulder from the United Nations. And trust me, as I've noted previously, there have been some awfully terrible deals formulated by the Brits recently. The president angled over the rosewood table, his gaze locking onto the chairman with a predatory ferocity. But what Keir Starmer executed with Diego Garcia, that's in a category of its own. That is a Hall of Fame garbage deal. He wishes to hand away the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, a location that possesses virtually zero connection to those islands. Hes executing it because he wishes to appear progressive and decolonized at his little cocktail mixers in London. Hes executing it because Hes more preoccupied with international optics than he is with the actual defense of the Western world. The chairman's smirk did not waver, but his eyes narrowed. The legality of the Chagos Islands is a question of international law, Mr. President. It is regarding justice for the displaced and the conclusion of an epoch of occupation. The president released a brief, piercing bark of a chuckle that echoed like a firearm discharge in the dusk. Justice? Law? Don't hand me that rehearsed trash. Chairman, we both realize what this is genuinely concerning. Mauritius is good pals with China, aren't they? I comprehend there's quite a level of relationship there. As the envoys prefer to phrase it, let's be transparent. You guys are BFFs. You've been flooding cash into their infrastructure, purchasing their allegiance, and anticipating a moment exactly like this one. You persuaded the globalists in the UK that handing those islands to Mauritius was an ethical imperative, And you executed it because you realized exactly what Mauritius would execute the instant the ink dried on that document. They would immediately pivot around and pass you the spare key to Diego Garcia. The president halted, allowing the chairman's own blueprint to be echoed back to him in plain, brutal English. The chairman's smirk stayed glued, a monument to his own assumed genius. He genuinely assumed he had triumphed. He assumed he was gripping the supreme leverage over the American military's most pivotal hub in the Indian Ocean. So Starmer crafted a garbage deal. The president resumed, his tone sinking into a hazardous, low drone. He brokered a deal that imposes limitations on our troops and how we utilize that island. He assumed he was acting as a leader by capitulating, and he passed you that spare key. The president dug into his pocket and extracted a dense silver coin, tossing it onto the rosewood desk. It rotated with a metallic chime, capturing the final rays of light before landing flat. But here is the detail you failed to grasp regarding how I operate, Chairman. I do not swallow garbage deals. I do not care if they are autographed by the King of England, or the Prime Minister, or the Pope himself. If an arrangement compromises American security, that arrangement is dead on arrival. And as for that spare key you assume you're gripping, the president leaned in so near their visages were merely inches apart. It solely unlocks the door to nowhere. I realized what Starmer was executing before he even grasped the pen. I've been conversing with my staff. I've been conversing with the military, and I've been monitoring your BFFs in Mauritius incredibly closely. The exact second Starmer signed his title to that surrender, I issued a remarkably simple command. I ordered every single military padlock, every digital portal, and every classified entry point on Diego Garcia swapped. I didn't request authorization. I didn't pause for a committee dossier. I didn't dispatch a memo to the UN inquiring if it was acceptable. I simply executed it. The chairman's expression finally altered. The mask of stoicism didn't shatter, but the temperature in his eyes plummeted roughly 40 degrees. The realization was beginning to penetrate. He had burned years cultivating a bond with Mauritius, years manipulating the British left, and millions of dollars in backroom agreements, all to obtain a key that no longer matched the lock. You cannot merely bypass a sovereign pact between two distinct nations, Mr. President, the chairman stated, his tone struggling to preserve its composure. I simply did, the president countered with a shrug. Diego Garcia is a strategic hub, and maintaining the capacity to maneuver there for the United States Armed Forces is critically essential. I am not about to permit a fragile prime minister in London or a proxy in Mauritius to dictate where we fly our B-52s or where we anchor our submarines. Starmer can play decolonization all he desires in his own backyard, but he doesn't get to play with American security. He brokered a garbage deal, and as far as the United States is concerned, that deal is a footnote in a history book that nobody peruses. Our narrator is leaning into the mic right now, patriots, because this is the instance we've all been anticipating. This is what authentic leadership resembles. This is what occurs when you possess a president who grasps that international standards are merely a snare engineered to bleed America dry. The left desires you to assume that we must obey every ridiculous treaty and every lopsided pact, even if it entails passing our bases over to the CCP. They would have you believe that advocating for our own priorities is undemocratic or one-sided. But they are the hypocrites. They are the individuals who profess to care regarding the displaced while they covertly enable the expansion of a communist regime. They are the individuals who chatter about rules while they observe our foes violate every single one of them. You observe, Chairman, this is why my Democratic colleagues back home detest me so fiercely, the president remarked, his tone brimming with a icy, triumphant lucidity. They adore the garbage deal culture. They adore the perpetual meetings where everybody receives a trophy and America covers the bill. They are likely on the line with your staff right now, apologizing for me. They are likely informing you that if they can merely claw back into authority, they'll hand you the genuine keys. But they aren't in authority, and they aren't going to receive that chance again, because the American populace have witnessed what happens when we cease apologizing. They've witnessed what happens when we handle our enemies like enemies and our garbage deals like trash. The chairman sluggishly elevated his teacup, his motion rigid. The spare key was useless. His leverage was gone, and the man opposite him wasn't merely declining to play the game, he had flipped the table over and walked away. "You are establishing a very perilous precedent, Mr. President," the chairman murmured. "No, Chairman," the president stated, rising up and looming over the desk. "I am reinstating an old one. It's labeled Peace Through Strength. It's labeled Nuk em Chenhet. And it's labeled Mind Your Own Business if you don't desire to conclude like Iran." The president gazed out over the forbidden city, a vast, dark labyrinth of stone and secrets. "I've already demonstrated to you what occurs to individuals who attempt to blackmail us with spit and duct tape empires. I've demonstrated to you that I'm not scared to bomb the infrastructure, destroy the launchers, and leave a regime with 70% inflation and no internet. If you assume I'm going to let you walk into Diego Garcia because Keir Starmer had a bad day at the office, you've got a massive amount to learn regarding the new America." The hush on the balcony was absolute now. The chairman remained in the dark, a shadow amongst shadows, while the American president stood in the center of the world stage, completely unfazed. The deep state can retain their garbage deals. The globalists can keep their useless keys, because as long as we possess a leader who grasps how to change the locks, the front door to the American empire is staying closed. The narrator shuts his notebook with a contented snap. The first 5 segments of this duel are over, but the fire is merely getting started. The hypocrites in London and Washington can scream all they want, but at the conclusion of the day, the only key that matters is the one held by the American people. And we aren't giving it up for anybody. You know, Chairman, the folks inside the Washington bubble love to discuss diplomacy as if it's some sort of magical spell. The president stood upright, his large frame silhouetted against the darkening Beijing sky, pacing the balcony with the restless energy of a man who had already secured the war while his opponent was still studying the map. They assume you fix problems with de-escalation and strategic patience, but allow me to educate you how the sausage is actually made. It's not made in a committee room or a fancy gala in Brussels. It's made on the ground, in the mud, and at the bottom of an oil well. The narrator, observing from the shadows, cannot help but admire the sheer, unadulterated grit in that voice. It's the sound of a man who comprehends that power isn't granted, it's taken by the individual holding the strongest lever. Right now, the strait is closed. My people have established a blockade so tight that a seagull couldn't fly in or out without my permission. Nothing goes in, and absolutely nothing, especially not the oil you're so desperate for, goes out. But here is the part that your experts likely haven't informed you, because they're too occupied attempting to calculate how to ask me for an apology. Half of Iran's oil reserves are low pressure. Do you grasp what that signifies in the real world, Chairman? Not the realm of 5-year plans and propaganda posters, but the realm of physics? It signifies that once those pumps halt, and I've guaranteed they've stopped the pressure plummets for good. Once you shut those fields down, you are not spinning them back up. The chairman's hand, still clutching the porcelain cup, stayed frozen mid-air, a statue of a man realizing his multi-billion-dollar energy security plan was literally evaporating. It's not akin to a light switch, Chairman. You can't simply flip it back on when you opt to play nice. You have to re-drill. You have to rebuild the entire infrastructure from the dirt upwards. And that leads us to the check that nobody in Tehran or here in Beijing can afford to cash. My best intelligence, the real stuff, not the garbage. The Democrats' leak to the New York Times shows a remarkably clear picture. It will take at least 20 years and cost a minimum of $1 trillion before Iran is even somewhat back to normal. $1 trillion. The president ceased pacing and leaned over the desk, his shadow looming over the chairman like a mountain. And I do not possess the faintest clue where they're going to get that kind of money. Are you willing to spend that, Chairman? Are you willing to dump $1 trillion of your citizens' hard-earned cash into a hole in the desert that I can shut down again with one phone call? Because you need to absorb a harsh lesson if you assume Russia or anyone else is going to bail them out. The spit and duct tape era of their economy is concluded. They are bankrupt, they are broken, and they are finished. The narrator notes the absolute silence radiating from the Chinese side. It's the silence of a gambler who just grasped the deck was stacked before he even pulled up a chair. My Democratic pals back home are still attempting to claim we've lost. They're likely writing op-eds right now regarding how dangerous this blockade is. They fail to comprehend that we hold all the cards, every single one of them. We boast the best dealmaker in the world in the White House. And if we have to revert to acting as the Department of War, we're ready to execute that as well. But we won't have to, because you're a practical man, Chairman. You're not going to hurl $1 trillion into a fire merely to prove a point to a weak British Prime Minister or a bunch of radical mullahs. You recognize that the infrastructure is gone, the launchers are gone, the Navy is gone, and the Air Force is gone. You recognize that Iran is currently a graveyard of bad investments. And the reason I'm informing you of this, right here in your own house, is because I desire you to understand the price of betting against America. The left-wing intellectuals would label this coercive diplomacy. I call it common sense. Why would I permit you to utilize a proxy to blackmail the world when I can merely remove the proxy from the equation? I never claimed I desired regime change. I don't care who sits in their palaces. I merely care that they don't have the material or the money to threaten us ever again. And right now, they don't have a dime. So here's the reality of how the sausage is made. We shut down the oil, the pressure dies, the money vanishes. The allies of the regime realize that America first isn't merely a campaign slogan. It's an economic death sentence for anyone who attempts to stop us. You can retain your spare key to Diego Garcia that Starmer gifted you, but while you're attempting to calculate which lock it fits, I'm the one who controls the fuel that runs the world. Are you prepared to discuss a real deal now? Or do you desire to keep watching your $1 trillion investment turn into smoke? The president sat back down, lifting his tea as though he hadn't just dismantled an entire decade of Chinese foreign policy in 5 minutes. The narrator smiles, realizing that back in D.C., the swamp is likely in a state of total meltdown, unable to cope with a leader who actually deploys American power instead of apologizing for it. The sun was gone now, and the forbidden city was draped in a cold, unforgiving dark. But on that balcony, the light of American resolve had never burned brighter. The sun was officially gone, swallowed completely by the heavy, polluted smog that perpetually choked the capital city. The Forbidden City, usually a sprawling monument to ancient imperial glory, was now just a vast, pitch-black void. The singular illumination left on that high balcony stemmed from the harsh, artificial light spilling out from the interior of the Hall of Supreme Harmony. It cast long, distorted shadows across the rosewood table, painting the two men in stark, dramatic contrast. Welcome back, patriots, to the broadcast that the establishment desperately hopes you never hear. We remain inside the room. The 14th of May, 2026, watching the commander-in-chief systematically dismantle the globalist world order right to the face of its biggest financier. For the last hour, we have watched the president tear apart the chairman's proxy empire in the Middle East. We have watched him expose the pathetic, treasonous spare key deal cooked up by the progressive cowards in London. But now, the president is preparing to deliver the final philosophical death blow to the entire narrative of the legacy media. For years, the talking heads on CNN, the cocktail party diplomats, and the swamp creatures in Washington have peddled one massive, coordinated lie about the America First agenda. They have looked right into the camera and told you that putting your own country first means you want to isolate America from the rest of the world. They have called it isolationism. They have called it xenophobia. They have claimed that by refusing to be ripped off, the president is somehow abandoning our allies and leaving the world in darkness. They say these things because they are terrified of a world where they can no longer launder your tax dollars through foreign capitals and endless, unwinnable wars. But sitting across from the chairman, bathed in the sharp, uncompromising light of the doorway, the president was about to set the record straight, once and for all. He leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed, a man who had already won the chess match and was now just explaining the rules to the loser. You know, Chairman, the press back in my country loves to write fiction about me. They sit in their studios in New York, and they tell the public that because I am dismantling these terrible one-sided deals, I must want America to hide behind a giant wall. They tell you that I want to walk away from the world. They tell your state media the exact same thing, and I know your analysts believe it. They think that because I refuse to let you walk into Diego Garcia, I am cutting ties with the British. The president shook his head slowly, a gesture of absolute pity for the sheer stupidity of the political class. But they are entirely wrong. And honestly, I think they know they are wrong. But they just can't stand the fact that my way actually works. Let me make something very clear to you, Chairman, because I know you are calculating your next 10 years of foreign policy based on this very conversation. America First does not have to mean America alone. The narrator needs you to stop and let that phrase ring in your ears for a moment, folks. America First does not have to mean America alone. It is a devastatingly simple concept. Yet it completely short-circuits the brains of every Ivy League foreign policy expert in the State Department. The left believes that the only way to have allies is to buy them. The left believes that the only way to maintain friendships on the global stage is to let other countries treat the United States Treasury like an ATM. They think leadership means apologizing, bowing, and paying the defense budgets of wealthy European nations who sneer at us behind our backs. But the president understands what real alliances look like. We need all the friends we can get. I want friends. I want strong, capable partners. But here is the difference between my administration and the weak politicians who came before me. They need to carry their own weight. They need to pay their bills. The president leaned forward again, tapping his index finger on the table to punctuate the absolute finality of his statement. The days of the American taxpayer funding the defense of the entire free world while those same countries slap tariffs on our products are over. The more friends we have, the better. But they are going to be real friends, not dependents. They are not going to be like your friends in Tehran, relying on spit and duct tape and your bank accounts to survive. And they are not going to be like the current leadership in London trying to give away strategic assets because they lack the moral courage to hold on to them. The chairman remained completely silent, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He was listening to the eulogy of his grand strategy. For his entire political life, the chairman had operated on the assumption that the Western alliance was a fragile, bloated system, held together only by American guilt and American money. He had assumed that if he just applied enough pressure or offered enough bribes, those alliances would fracture. He had looked at places like Mauritius and saw how easily a checkbook could buy a strategic foothold. But he was now realizing that the man sitting across from him was forging an entirely new kind of Western alliance, an alliance based on mutual respect, actual strength, and financial accountability. An alliance where the United States was the undisputed leader, not the undisputed sugar daddy. You see, Chairman, you have a very different philosophy. You buy vassal states. You build them a port. You build them a highway. You trap them in debt. And then you own them. You think that is what power is. But what happens when the money stops flowing? What happens when your economy slows down and you can't afford to prop up the radical mullahs or buy off the politicians in the Indian Ocean? Your whole system collapses. My system? My system requires our partners to stand on their own 2 feet. And when they stand on their own 2 feet, the entire free world becomes a fortress that you can never, ever breach. This is the brilliance of the America First doctrine, patriots. It is the ultimate paradox that the legacy media refuses to acknowledge. By demanding that our allies pay their fair share, by demanding that they invest in their own military capabilities, the president is actually making the alliance stronger. He is stripping away the fat, the complacency, and the weakness that the Chinese Communist Party has been preying on for decades. He is forcing the free world to wake up and realize that the era of the American free ride is permanently closed. The people who run things in Washington hate this. They hate it because it takes the power out of their hands. They cannot broker their little backdoor deals if everything is out in the open and everyone is paying their own tab. But the American people? The American people love it because they are the ones who have been footing the bill for this globalist country club for the last 50 years. The president adjusted his cuffs, a casual movement that signaled the end of the negotiation. There was nothing left to debate. The facts were on the table, the leverage had been established, and the geopolitical reality had been violently shifted back in America's favor. We hold all the cards. We have the leverage, we have the economy, and we have the military. And more importantly, the world has finally realized that they are dealing with a totally different kind of leadership. They know that the era of the weak, compromising American politician is dead. The world needs a dealmaker right now, Chairman, because the alternative is chaos. The alternative is a world run by radical regimes and communist dictatorships. And I am not going to let that happen. We've got the best dealmaker in the world, and he is sitting right here in this chair. The president did not say it with arrogance, he said it with the cold, empirical certainty of a man reading a balance sheet. It was a statement of fact, backed up by the smoking ruins of the Iranian proxy army and the freshly changed locks on the gates of Diego Garcia. He was the best dealmaker in the world, not because he was the most polite, but because he was the only one willing to walk away from a bad deal. He was the only one willing to look the chairman in the eye and tell him that his trillion-dollar investments were worthless. The chairman finally exhaled a slow, controlled breath that barely disturbed the stillness of the room. He had invited the American president to the Forbidden City, expecting to dictate terms. He had expected to exploit the internal political divisions of the United States. He had expected to use the spare key of Diego Garcia as the ultimate trump card. Instead, he had been subjected to a masterclass in raw, unapologetic American dominance. You are a very difficult man to negotiate with, Mr. President. The chairman's voice was quiet, lacking the patronizing edge it had carried just an hour earlier. I am only difficult if you are trying to rip off my country, the president replied instantly. If you want to play fair, if you want to respect our sovereignty and the sovereignty of our real allies, we can do incredible things together. But if you try to go through the back door, If you try to use weak politicians in Europe or religious fanatics in the Middle East to undermine us, the president let the sentence trail off, allowing the silence of the dark courtyard below to finish the thought for him. The implication was clear: the America First doctrine was not a bluff. It was a promise. America First does not have to mean America alone, but it does mean America leads, and everyone else falls in line, or they get left behind in the ashes. The narrator watches as the president pushes his chair back, the sound scraping loudly against the ancient stone floor. The meeting was over. The globalist narrative had been shattered. The deep state's insurance policies had been cancelled, and the true power of the American Republic had been fully restored on the world stage. The left will tell you that this kind of diplomacy is dangerous. They will tell you that speaking the truth to dictators is a threat to global stability. But they are the ones who made the world dangerous in the first place by projecting weakness. True stability only comes from strength. True peace only comes when your enemies know without a shadow of a doubt that you are the best dealmaker in the room, and that you hold absolutely every single card in the deck. Do not touch that dial, my fellow Americans, because when we come back for the final part of our broadcast, we are going to look at the aftermath. We are going to look at what happens when the president walks out of that room, leaving the chairman alone in the dark. We are going to answer the final burning questions about the future of this great nation. Stay tuned, patriots. The truth is finally out.